All right, folks, back in the saddle with Dave Grindle, your humble host, founder of Zero Fail Enterprises, creator of the Unwilling, Pokemon, The Convergence, the Star Wars reboot, all the projects that have brought us together and have led us to sit down here and have these conversations. Now, we got it started, so let's keep it going. We've spent a few full podcasts, I'm very happy to say, discussing the details, the fineries, and the broad brushstrokes of the Unwilling. And I want to keep in the theme of what we've discussed on AI, on factions, on locations, and let's get to possibly my favorite subject concerning the game and the story, the vehicles. Now, I think what is missing from many MMOs, and I can't say all by any means because there are so many MMOs that somehow remain in the cut or have a more, I believe you would call them a cult following, which I don't understand. And I won't say games like Eve, Second Life, these games where they're dedicated to a modicum of reality in this transposed universe that they're in, and they seem very fleshed out. They seem very well put together, and that's one thing that I will definitely predict audiences proclaiming for the Unwilling. Now, pardon me. Mainly, I want to talk about airships, but there are so many practical applications for Luftor throughout the course of the story and how it breaks down mathematically and scientifically as a concept that we are able to drive the Unwilling and drive airships in a way that I don't think has been done before. I can honestly say, if it's been done before, it has to be something that has somehow escaped my gaze. Because I trawled the internet hardcore looking for a place where this has been done before, because that was the last thing I wanted, was somebody talking to me about, oh, well, this came from such and such game, or this was in such and such story. And that would be crushing, but it's not like there are more than a handful of fully original games that come across our plate in any sort of frequency. Now, I will start with the basics of Luftor and how this translates through the story into the practical use of airships throughout this world. Now, we know we've talked a little bit about the conflict that arises from the discovery of Luftor in the first place, and how really this discovery launches a world into war. Now, for me, I feel like there has to be a good cause for the world to go to war. Mostly because the reasons that have dragged us into conflicts that massive IRL haven't been that compelling for me. Historically, looking back at it, now hindsight is 2020, but really, I just am not impressed by the reasons why this world has torn itself apart so many times. Both on a national level between two countries and in a war so massive that it is called forever in the annals of history as long as we're keeping track, world wars. Now, in the thousands of years that people have been slaughtering each other for resources or land or pride or honor, we've only had 2 world wars. Now, don't get me wrong, there have been massive conflicts throughout history that I think would be called world wars, but in the last 100 years, we've had 2, and they have been legit enough, if you want to say that, to have made a massive impact on us as a global community. And I really want, through the course of the Unwilling, the world to evolve, and I can only imagine when all realms are player controlled. And Shiva knows how many years that would take, simply for the size, the scale, and the magnitude of the entire world, and the movements that are both AI controlled and deal with human interface that drive the war forward, drive changes in geography and national borders, in tone of the world. And okay, now that we've reached 5 minutes and I've already started just to stumble down the block as I usually do, I think that when we have to put ourselves in the shoes, just like as players in this world, we have to put ourselves in the shoes of a person living in that time frame where our lives are good. Okay, because unlike a lot of representations of historical Europe, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Classical Age, I do see a lot of disease, a lot of poverty, a lot of starvation, a lot of corruption, a lot of crime, war, senseless violence that has limited the human species. And we see that reflected in many fictional and non-fictional, obviously non-fictional, but many fictional representations of worlds based on our past. Fantasy games like the sword and shield aspect for a reason, because I think it's a much more compelling time, not just in terms of war, but in terms of how people thought. Now, it is different in the world of the Unwilling simply because the aspects I stated just a few seconds ago are the main driving forces of the world. And the sovereigns, the leadership, the government is not at all like what we are used to in fat kings and queens living in luxury, their families well taken care of, living in massive palaces, while 99% of the population, barring the other nobles and governors and leaders and military commanders who also live in luxury, most of the world lives in poverty and sadness and taxation out the butt. In The Unwilling, a king is a king because their heritage has survived. If they are one of a bloodline, or now don't get me wrong, there are plenty of democratic governments, republic governments. There are nations and factions that have no government, and it's sort of just a collective pool of people, like Libertania, like Regalia, who are independently wealthy, independently as a collective. But we'll get into that later when we take 30 straight minutes to truly discuss each and every faction in detail. Now, what we're focusing on for Luftor and the start of the revolution for vehicles springs from a conflict between the Empire of Burgundia and the Republic of Foundros, north and south halves of the central continent, which, on their own, Burgundia does reflect one of the poorer nations, the poorer factions who never really recovered from the Civil War centuries ago and find themselves stuck where most of the world has not developed incredibly fast as opposed to Burgundia, but the brutality of the Civil War that split the central continent into two nations set back both sides in manpower, in technology, in resources, and has led them to stay behind the curve for about 6 centuries. And at the outset, they do both rely heavily on mining industries. And it is a stroke of luck that discovers Luftor. Burgundian mining companies they have detachments in a pretty deep point in the Lufthauser mountain range, the massive mountain chain which splits the central continent right down the middle, from east to west, like a jagged line through the map. Reveals, breaks through a standard coal and silver vein, and unfortunately, 2 or 3 of the lead miners who were right there when this cave-in happened, or this collapse event happened, fell to their deaths over hundreds of feet into this cavern, big empty cavern, with the exception of the ceilings, the walls, and it can be seen for many directions in many sub-veins and sub-compartments and spaces. that there is luminous, glowing, sparkling sapphire rock. And the survivors who are now crowding around the remains, the jagged rock where the wall and floor fell away, where the initial miner struck, and they're gaping in awe at what they're seeing, because it's different from anything they've ever seen. Now, keep in mind, magic and the arcane are only present in Kargoth, where it's a traditional heritage that's passed down. The knowledge of elemental magic, illusion magic, alteration magic. I mean, I'm looking at you, man. Skyrim, Bethesda. I think you guys started and nearly perfected. Now, I won't discount the mods that have come out that have perfected the pursuit of being a mage, being a wizard. But that is what you see, is human beings using their pineal abilities as well as their mental intuition to channel and direct arcane energy, earth energy. They're really, what they're doing is harnessing the life of the planet and molding it with the aptitude of their own spirit to manifest magic. And I think that's found in one other place, but I'll get to that later. Okay, we'll get to that later in general. But, so they're in awe, and this only gets more intense as the workers begin to build constructs and lower ropes and ladders and get into this cavern safely. And when they do, obviously one of these supervisors, the foreman who's been called in to inspect and see what's going on here, they come in and they chip off a piece of the rock. And when they do, they're not quick enough, because they chip off this pebble-sized bit and it zips up to the ceiling. They are at a complete loss for words as to what's going on, and they continue to mine at the ore, and they find that when they break off, especially small pieces, it makes moves swiftly to the floor. To the ceiling. And only by cracking off increasingly large portions do they find that the rock goes from incredibly fast ascent to slower ascent to a general floating to a weightlessness when you try to pick it up, because they work in concert, and the showering pebbles and debris and pieces that have broken off, I think it would be cool, as they're chiseling away at this large chunk, that all of the debris that would normally be flying everywhere is just popping up towards the ceiling, bouncing off with the ever so delicate ping against the ceiling of the cavern. And then when they finally lop off a big chunk, it just sort of like almost bouncing floats gently on the floor. And they put hands underneath it to lift it and find that it's nearly weightless. And so word travels to Burgandia quickly, because, they dispatch a rider, a messenger with all haste, directly to the capital with a sample. Now, what's interesting is this sample is a collective of fist-sized rocks, which they've had to lash to the rider and have a harness of stone, heavy chunks of stone, to hold him down. Now, this would look crazy to anybody just being passed by this rider on the road, because it looks like there's hundreds and hundreds of pounds of stone on a yoke harness around this dude's shoulders, or chick, right? Equal opportunity all across the world of the Unwilling. Hashtag make game equality great again. So this rider with a yoke and two fat stacks of stone coming across his shoulders and hanging down. And as he flies, he zips across the landscape with his horse as if it's nothing. But he tries to travel mostly by night because there is still a fear of Foundrosian presence, of outside presence in the form of spies who, and as well as mercantile figures from across the world that, do business throughout Burgundia despite its poor economic status. And I feel like there's opportunity for larger, more successful factions to be taking advantage of places like this and to see their influence simply by buying out and restoring what's been lost at the price of sovereignty. But they ride, and I think that would be a interesting point to draw in the involvement of Silic, because Silic does have hands, it does have presence across the world, across the central continent and Gascar. Ladox is one of the few nations that has historically rallied to fight against them and has been the most successful out of any of the factions at doing the most direct and indirect damage to Silic as a faction during the course of many prior wars. Now, Silic having an influence in Burgundia would be an interesting tip for me, because then when the rider passes through, several Cilician eyes of importance see what's happening, and they take the word of mysterious happenings, relaying their own messages to the capital, following the trail of this rider as best they can until the Luftor is taken to the capital, taken to the Emperor, and the Emperor of Burgundia simply freaks out. I mean, this has become an incredible resource. Now, he realizes the gravity of the situation, that they have something incredibly important, and the more he hears that there's a ton of it in the Lufthausers, it's equal parts joy and trepidation, because he can't keep this to himself. And he realizes that Burgundia, being in a poor position to defend itself, is not going to become rich and powerful off Luftor. Silic's going to get involved. Now, they may be able to profit initially, but to him that means we have to hoard as much of it as we can. And I think this train of hundreds and hundreds of wagons, workers, supplies, caravans traveling out from the capital, private industries, government-run contracting businesses for the mining industry, as well as AI. Yeah, okay, so that's the two halves of it, really, as well as individuals who have heard whispers, heading south towards the Lufthausers, nearly 250, 300 miles. As this huge train snakes its way there, it's hard to avoid attention at that point. Fully immersing Silic in the situation, who blend in, their Cilician operatives blend into that caravan. They start finding out what's going on. And when they get there turns out to have been a Foundrosian operative, a spy, in there as well. And that person breaks off once they've confirmed and stolen a sample. They go to Foundros. Now, I think that would be very interesting to, make it. This person essentially has to have a pack mule to travel the nearly 500 to 600 miles across the Lufthausers, and then another several hundred miles to get to the capital, and takes off on this very dangerous quest. And I think it would be cool to have somebody learning how to use the Luftor as they go, where they too realize that you can't just transport Luftor. They load down a pack mule with as much weight in rocks as they can, and then keep a small at the bottom of those packs, so that and to see the pack sort of lopsided, almost as if in such a small form, even all that weight can't contain it. But that just lends to the strength of properties in, the relationship between size and output becomes important when Luftor becomes applied in warfare and in technology. So we see the mix, we see the gears start to turn in the relationships between different factions based on this. Now, eventually, Burgandia it becomes public. Now, Silic almost has a military figure and a cadre of troops show up at the front door of the Imperial main palace in the capital city of Burgandia. And says, we know what's going on, and we're not here to start a war, we're not here to take it from you. We're here to help you profit, okay? We'll make you rich again. We'll restore your empire for rights to that resource. And puts 1,000 wagon loads of coins at the feet of Burgandia. Burgandia then makes a crucial deal. They give Silic, they give Silic sole rights. They give over all of their Luftor and all the Luftor to be mined in the future and presently directly to Silic. And Silic in turn begins to move massive amounts of troops and labor power to Burgandia. Now, this cannot escape the notice of Foundros, who, if they hadn't have gotten their messenger through after nearly a month and a half, almost 2 months of travel to get back to Foundros, he shows them, and the first thing that Foundros does is send their own mining crews north, and they start to mine in the vicinity of the southern middle reaches. You know what I'm saying? Like their side of the border, which is tentatively drawn down the middle of the Lufthausers, as best as can be measured. And they start to mine as well. And what they find is when they do delve deep into the central mountains, they discover wealths of Luftor. Silic plays a key role because one of its main, most affluent and influential engineers and scientists and researchers by the name of Godris Dahlgren, who look up some U.S. naval history on Dahlgren and you'll find out a little bit about him and the subsequent facilities named after him. But Godris Dahlgren, and this individual puts in hours and hours and hours of study on Luftor because Silic is looking to, number one, capitalize on the most exotic and precious material that's ever been discovered, but they want to put its powers of flight to use. Now, they don't give Dahlgren any specific instructions. They say to him, what can we do with this? And after painstaking research, he not only makes a huge leap forward because people like Dahlgren are who are responsible for the rise of black powder technology, of conventional cannons, let's say 17th century cannons and carronades, both the typical sweet classical ages, age of sail warships, all the classes, sloops, cutters, frigates, brigs. I don't call them ships of the line, I call them battleships because I like that better. But just wait, because I know I said this was supposed to be about vehicles, but in 3 minutes I can explain to you, and I will, man. I'll try to have 4 left, maybe 4:30. So for about a minute and a half, let's wrap on the Luftor and its rise, okay, and its implementation. Luftor is broken down, and it is discovered through this guy doing Da Vinci-esque experiments. That's sort of my perspective, my view of what it would be like, as he attempts to apply this to all manner of vehicles, to help it to implement troops, to use it as a fuel. And what he finds most interesting is that when you create a wooden or iron container, a crate, a chest, and you fill it by best means with Luftor and seal it, it doesn't amplify the power, but it's still very powerful. So, I mean, if you can wrestle 50 quarter-sized chunks of this into a chest, and you tie that to somebody, they'll float up in the air indefinitely. And Dahlgren famously ties a noose with several hundred feet of rope to a dummy and attaches a chest to a harness on this dummy and lets it loose and reels out the hose. And it continues until the rope is taut. So, as best Dahlgren can tell, there is no altitude ceiling for Luftor. And he continues to lengthen it up to 1,000+ feet, and it's still taut. And is a chore to bring back down. Okay, I guess it's going to be 3 minutes. Now, he single-handedly invents a steam engine, one which burns coal to maintain heat, to create steam, and in doing so applies Luftor to this engine to create luft steam. And by manipulating several, as best airtight things as can be found, as we don't have yet, but like the hot air balloon filled with luft air is incredible. Like the power of levitation, the properties of levitation are, oh my god, I lost the word. Jeez, dude. And with time in a crunch too. Okay, they're multiplied hundreds of times. Okay, I think relatively. Okay, when you make Luftor into luft steam, the power is incredible. So what he does is when strolling by the harbor one morning, he looks at all of the ships across all of these wharves: trade ships, warships, private ships, fishing ships, commercial ships, and transports, and he has a cutter, right? A retired cutter, a very small warship that is now used as a fishing ship, brought to his compound. And when he lines piping made from these skins all around the decks of the ship. So all around the weather deck, all around the cargo bay, along the keel, and at several intervals like a skeleton for the interior of the ship. And he connects that to the luft steam engine. And when he does, the ship just lifts. It just lifts right off the ground. I'll fit it in the last 30 seconds and it can be dramatic. All right. Like I said, the ship just takes off. It just floats into the sky. And luckily enough, he starts to, when he realizes there's no way to let the steam out, he starts to stab the skins one by one, and it releases this choking, noxious gas. Luft steam is very as has been proven by human experimentation at this point, luft steam is extremely abrasive when it's inhaled. And it just starts filling and pouring out of the ports, the gun ports on the empty gun ports on the side. It starts pouring out of the grating on the weather decks, and the ship does lose altitude. And as the ship, at about 5 to 10 miles an hour, makes impact with the water, Dahlgren knows that this is the future. And that is the first airship, the first time that a ship has flown. Now, we progress over 3 years, and there's where the story starts. But throughout the course of both player blueprint engineering, AI initiative on our part to introduce new technologies over the course of time, we will eventually implement so many, an unending number of designs and constructs for battleships and trade ships in the airship classes, But we also will have air carriers because I designed a wooden and cloth frame, Luftdoor driven glider, which comes off like an aircraft.